507, with the rise of Augustus. Contemporary Latin authors such as Virgil and Livy also became part of the curriculum. 508. The rhetor was a teacher of oratory or public speaking. The art of speaking, as dicendi, was highly prized as a marker of social and intellectual superiority, and eloquentia, speaking ability, eloquence, was considered the glue of a civilized society. 509. Rhetoric was not so much a body of knowledge, though it required a command of references to the Literarcanon. 510, as it was a mode of expression and decorum that distinguished those who held social power. 511. The ancient model of rhetorical training restraint, coolness under pressure, modesty, and good humor. 512. Endured into the 18th century as a Western educational ideal. 513. In Latin, illiteratus, Greek agrammatos, could mean both unable to read and write and lacking in cultural awareness or sophistication. 514. Higher education promoted career advancement, particularly for an equestrian in imperial service. Eloquence and learning were considered marks of a well-bred man and worthy of reward. 515. The poet Horace, for instance, was given a top-notch education by his father, a prosperous former slave. 516. Urban elites throughout the empire shared a literary culture imbued with Greek educational ideals. Paideia. 517. Hellenistic cities sponsored schools of higher learning as an expression of cultural achievement. 518. Young men from Rome who wished to pursue the highest levels of education often went abroad to study rhetoric and philosophy, mostly to one of several Greek schools in Athens. The curriculum in the East was more likely to include music and physical training along with literacy and numeracy. 519. On the Hellenistic model, Vespasian endowed chairs of grammar, Latin and Greek rhetoric, and philosophy at Rome, and gave teachers special exemptions from taxes and legal penalties, though primary school masters did not receive these benefits. Quintilian held the first chair of grammar. 520. In the Eastern Empire, Berytus, present-day Beirut, was unusual in offering a Latin education, and became famous for its school of Roman law. 521. The cultural movement known as the Second Sophistic, 1st–3rd century AD, promoted the assimilation of Greek and Roman social, educational, and aesthetic values, and the Greek proclivities for which Nero had been criticized were regarded from the time of Hadrian onward as integral to imperial culture. 522. Educated women. Literate women ranged from cultured aristocrats to girls trained to be calligraphers and scribes. 523. 524. The girlfriends addressed in Augustan love poetry, although fictional, represent an ideal that a desirable woman should be educated, well-versed in the arts, and independent to a frustrating degree. 525. Education seems to have been standard for daughters of the senatorial and equestrian orders during the empire. 501. A highly educated wife was an asset for the socially ambitious household, but one that Martial regards as a unnecessary luxury. 523. Portrait of a literary woman from Pompeii, ca. 50 AD. The woman who achieved the greatest prominence in the ancient world for her learning was Hypatia of Alexandria, who educated young men in mathematics, philosophy, and astronomy, and advised the Roman prefect of Egypt on politics. Her influence put her into conflict with the Bishop of Alexandria, Cyril, who may have been implicated in her violent death in 415 at the hands of a Christian mob. 526. Shape of literacy. Literacy began to decline, perhaps dramatically, during the socio-political crisis of the 3rd century. 527. Julian, the only emperor after the conversion of Constantine to reject Christianity, banned Christians from teaching the classical curriculum, on the grounds that they might corrupt the minds of youth. 528. But during and after the Christianization of the empire, the Church Fathers and other Christians adopted and used Latin and Greek literature, philosophy and natural science in biblical interpretation. 529. While the book roll had emphasized the continuity of the text, the codex format encouraged a piecemeal approach to reading by means of citation, fragmented interpretation, and the extraction of maxims. 530. In the 5th and 6th centuries, as the Western Roman Empire declined, reading became rarer even for those within the church hierarchy. 531. However, in the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as Byzantine Empire, reading continued throughout the Middle Ages as reading was of primary importance as an instrument of the Byzantine civilization. 532. Literature. A fresco in Pompeii depicting a poet, thought to be Euphorion, and Aphmal reading a diptych in the traditional literary canon, literature under Augustus, along with that of the late Republic, has been viewed as the golden age of Latin literature, embodying the classical ideals of unity of whole, the proportion of the parts, and the careful articulation of an apparently seamless composition. 533. The three most influential classical Latin poets Virgil, Horace, and Ovid belong to this period. Virgil wrote the Aeneid, creating a national epic for Rome in the manner of the Homeric epics of Greece. Horace perfected the use of Greek lyric meters in Latin verse. Ovid's erotic poetry was enormously popular, but ran afoul of the Augustan moral program. It was one of the ostensible causes for which the emperor exiled him to Tomis, present-day Constanta, Romania, where he remained to the end of his life. Ovid's Metamorphoses was a continuous poem of 15 books weaving together Greco-Roman mythology from the creation of the universe to the deification of Julius Caesar. Ovid's versions of Greek myths became one of the primary sources of later classical mythology, and his work was so influential in the Middle Ages that the 12th and 13th centuries have been called the Age of Ovid. 534. The principal Latin prose author of the Augustan age is the historian Livy, whose account of Rome's founding and early history became the most familiar version in modern-era literature. Vitruvius's book De Architectura, the only complete work on architecture to survive from antiquity, also belongs to this period. Latin writers were immersed in the Greek literary tradition, and adapted its forms and much of its content, but Romans regarded satire as a genre in which they surpassed the Greeks. Horace wrote verse satires before fashioning himself as an Augustan court poet, and the early Principate also produced the satirists Spersius and Juvenal. The satires of Juvenal offers a lively curmudgeon's perspective on urban society. Statue in Constanta, Romania, the ancient colony Tomis, commemorating of its exile. The period from the mid-1st century through the mid-2nd century has conventionally been called the Silver Age of Latin literature. Under Nero, disillusioned writers reacted to Augustinism. 535. The three leading writers Seneca the philosopher, dramatist, and tutor of Nero, Lucan, his nephew, who turned Caesar's civil war into an epic poem, and the novelist Petronius, Satyricon, all committed suicide after incurring the emperor's displeasure. Seneca and Lucan were from Hispania, as was the later epigrammatist and keen social observer Martial, who expressed his pride in his Celtiberian heritage. 80. Martial and the epic poet Statius, whose poetry collection Selvi had a far-reaching influence on Renaissance literature. 536. Wrote during the reign of Domitian. The so-called Silver Age produced several distinguished writers, including the encyclopedist Pliny the Elder, his nephew, known as Pliny the Younger, and the historian Tacitus, The Natural History of the elder Pliny, who died during disaster relief efforts in the wake of the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD, is a vast collection on flora and fauna, gems and minerals, climate, medicine, freaks of nature, works of art, and antiquarian lore. Tacitus's reputation as a literary artist matches or exceeds his value as a historian. Winking sad smiley 537. His stylistic experimentation produced one of the most powerful of Latin prose styles. 538. The 12 Caesars by his contemporary Suetonius is one of the primary sources for imperial biography. Among imperial historians who wrote in Greek are Dionysius of Halicarnassus, the Jewish historian Josephus, and the senator Cassius Dio. Other major Greek authors of the empire include the biographer and antiquarian Plutarch, the geographer Strabo, and the rhetorician and satirist Lucian. Popular Greek romance novels were part of the development of long-form fiction works, represented in Latin by the Satyricon of Petronius and the Golden Ass of Apuleius. From the 2nd to the 4th centuries, the Christian authors who would become the Latin Church Fathers were in active dialogue with the classical tradition, within which they had been educated. Tertullian, a convert to Christianity from Roman Africa, was the contemporary of Apuleius and one of the earliest prose authors to establish a distinctly Christian voice. After the conversion of Constantine, Latin literature is dominated with Christian perspective. 539, when the orator Symmachus argued for the preservation of Rome's religious traditions, he was effectively opposed by Ambrose, the Bishop of Milan and future Saint Adibate, preserved by their missives. 540, in the late 4th century, Jerome produced the Latin translation of the Bible that became authoritative as the Vulgate. Augustine, another of the Church Fathers from the province of Africa, has been called one of the most influential writers of Western culture, and his Confessions is sometimes considered the first autobiography of Western literature. In The City of God Against the Pagans, Augustine builds a vision of an eternal, spiritual Rome, a new imperium sine fine that will outlast the collapsing empire. Brescia casket, an ivory box with biblical imagery, late 4th century, in contrast to the unity of classical Latin. The literary aesthetic of late antiquity has a tessellated quality that has been compared to mosaics characteristic of the period. 541, a continuing interest into religious traditions of Rome prior to Christian dominion is found into the 5th century, with the Saturnalia of Macrobius and the marriage of Philology and Mercury of Martialus Capella. Prominent Latin poets of late antiquity include Ausonius Prudentius, Claudian, and Sidonius Apollinaris. Ausonius, d.c. 394, the Bordelaise tutor of the Emperor Gratian, was at least nominally a Christian, though, throughout his occasionally obscene mixed-genre poems, he retains a literary interest in the Greco-Roman gods and even Druidism. The imperial panegyrist Claudian, d. 404, was a illustrious who appears never to have converted. Prudentius, d.c. 413, born in Hispania Tarraconensis and a fervent Christian, was thoroughly versed in the poets of the classical tradition, 542, and transforms their vision of poetry as a monument of immortality into an expression of the poet's quest for eternal life culminating in Christian salvation. 543, Sidonius, d. 486, a native of Lugdunum, was a Roman senator and bishop of Clermont who cultivated a traditional villa lifestyle as he watched the Western Empire succumb to barbarian incursions. His poetry and collected letters offer a unique view of life in late Roman Gaul from the perspective of a man who survived the end of his world. 544, Religion. The Pantheon in Rome, a Roman temple originally built under Augustus and later rebuilt under Hadrian in the 2nd century, dedicated to Rome's polytheistic religion before its conversion into a Catholic Church in the 7th century, 545. Religion in the Roman Empire encompassed the practices and beliefs the Romans regarded as their own, as well as the many cults imported to Rome or practiced by peoples throughout the provinces. The Romans thought of themselves as highly religious, and attributed their success as a world power to their collective piety, pietas, in maintaining good relations with gods, pax deorum. The archaic religion believed to have been handed down from the earliest kings of Rome was the foundation of the mos maiorum, the way of the ancestors or tradition, viewed as central to Roman identity. 546. There was no principle analogous to separation of church and state. The priesthoods of the state religion were filled from the same social pool of men who held public office, and in the imperial era, the Pontifex Maximus was the emperor. Roman religion was practical and contractual, based on the principle of doudes, I give that you might give. Religion depended on knowledge and correct practice of prayer, ritual, and sacrifice, not on faith or dogma, although Latin literature preserves learned speculation on the nature of the divine and its relation to human affairs. For ordinary Romans, religion was a part of daily life. 547. Each home had a household shrine at which prayers and libations to the family's domestic deities were offered. Neighborhood shrines and sacred places such as springs and groves dotted the city. Apuleius, 2nd century, described the everyday quality of religion in observing how people who passed a cult place might make a vow or a fruit offering, or merely sit for a while. 548. The Roman calendar was structured around religious observances. In the imperial era, as many as 135 days of the year were devoted to religious festivals and games. Ludi. 549. Women, slaves, and children all participated in a range of religious activities. Dionysius, Bacchus, with long torch sitting on a throne, with Helios, Sol, Aphrodite, Venus, and other gods. Fresco from Pompeii. A Roman priest, his head ritually covered with a fold of his toga, extends a patera in a gesture of libation. 2nd-3rd century, statuettes representing Roman and Gallic deities for personal devotion at private shrines. In the wake of the Republic's collapse, state religion had adapted to support the new regime of the emperors. As the first Roman emperor, Augustus justified the novelty of one-man rule with a vast program of religious revivalism and reform. Public vows formerly made for the security of their public now were directed at the well-being of the emperor. So-called emperor worship expanded on a grand scale the traditional Roman veneration of the ancestral dead and of the genius, the divine tutelary Eutheri individual. Upon death, an emperor could be made a state divinity, divus, by vote of the Senate. Imperial cult, influenced by Hellenistic ruler cult, became one of the major ways Rome advertised its presence in the provinces and cultivated shared cultural identity and loyalty throughout the empire. Cultural precedent in the eastern provinces facilitated a rapid dissemination of imperial cult, extending as far as the Augustan military settlement at Najran, in present-day Saudi Arabia. AC. Rejection of the state religion became tantamount to treason against the emperor. This was the context for Rome's conflict with Christianity, which Romans variously regarded as a form of atheism and novel superstitio. The Romans are known for the great number of deities they honored, a capacity that earned the mockery of early Christian polemicists. As the Romans extended their dominance throughout the Mediterranean world, their policy, in general, was to absorb the deities and cults of other peoples rather than try to eradicate them. One way that Rome promoted stability among diverse peoples was by supporting their religious heritage, building temples to local deities that framed their theology within the hierarchy of Roman religion. Inscriptions throughout the empire record the side-by-side worship of local and Roman deities, including dedications made by Romans to local gods. 551. By the height of the empire, new